In this module, I will cover the regulations associated with hazardous waste management. There are two different challenges associated with hazardous waste. The first has to deal with the generation of new hazardous waste. And these regulations are going to control the source, transport, and fate of these chemicals so that we are assured that there's no new environmental hazards created. One of the major policies is part of the RCRA legislation that we'll be covering, and it includes something called cradle-to-grave management. And so this includes control of what hazardous waste is generated, how it is transported, and its ultimate disposal. And one of the key parts to this is that there will be paperwork associated with every step of this, such that if we gum up to barrels that have been disposed of properly, 20, 30, 50 years into the future, there is a manifest system where we can look at that manifest and say exactly how that waste was generated, what is contained in the barrel, and everything about the life cycle of that waste. The second issue with hazardous waste management is the cleanup of previously disposed of and mostly improperly disposed of waste. And so this is old waste. And this creates a huge problem in the United States because this legislation is only 20 to 30 years old. And yet we have had industrial production and industrial activity for over 100 years in the United States. And so all of the hazardous waste that was generated before the inception of RCRA, or the first legislation that we'll talk about, is out there in the environment, creating pollution and public health risk. These are some pictures of some classic and very common examples of previous generation of hazardous waste. And so one thing that we'll see very common is a site that has unlabeled drums. So at some point there was an industrial site or some landowner that accepted waste as a means to make money, and you'll see these unlabeled drums, and you'll have no idea as an environmental engineer going onto the site where the waste came from, what's in the waste. There's no labels. And oftentimes some of these drums will have had corrosion and obviously be leaking their unknown contents into the subsurface. And so the site characterization is a major task. Makes me tired just thinking of it. What, where, and who. So who generated this, what did they generate, and where has it gone? Another common issue is abandoned dry cleaners. So these are very prevalent in the United States, and they have released oftentimes perchloroethylene, which is called PCE. It's a chlorinated solvent, and chlorinated solvents are very common in the environment because of their use in industry. So if we have an abandoned dry cleaner or any dry cleaning operation before the inception of these rules that dumped their waste out back, it's very common that we'll find chlorinated solvents in the surrounding environment. Now, as we enter the discussion of the legislation, one of the first things that was defined by hazardous waste legislation is the definition of hazardous waste. And the EPA has defined hazardous waste by either one or two ways. So either of these would create the definition of a hazardous waste. The first is the EPA has derived 4 lists, and if a chemical is listed on any of these lists, it's defined as a hazardous waste as a listed hazardous waste. It's important to understand that this may include specific compounds or specific activities. So any production from activities, industrial processes would generate hazardous waste. The second way for hazardous waste to be defined is to exhibit any of the following characteristics. So any waste that exhibits ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic characteristics is defined as hazardous. And this is called a characteristic waste. And the waste only has to have any one of the 4 characteristics. to be defined as hazardous. So this definition was outlined in the first legislation that we're going to discuss, called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and it's often defined as RCRA and discussed as RCRA. It came online in 1976, and the purpose was to regulate the generation and disposal of hazardous waste. So this applied to new hazardous waste. It did not address abandoned or closed waste disposal sites. It regulates hazardous waste production. It also regulates non-hazardous waste, municipal solid waste, which we discussed in our previous lesson plan. Non-hazardous waste, solid waste. This waste simply has to be landfilled, and it defines proper landfilling as the dual liner system with leachate collection that we studied. In this lesson plan, we're going to focus on its definition of hazardous waste, which included the listed hazardous waste and the characteristic hazardous waste. The third thing it does is it establishes the manifest system that I showed you, the cradle-to-grave manifest system, such that when hazardous waste is generated, an ID number is produced that follows that with paperwork all the way to disposal. So RCRA establishes the standards and permitting requirements for storage, treatment, and disposal of newly generated hazardous waste. It includes requirements for closure and post-closure monitoring, and this includes municipal solid waste landfills and hazardous disposal options. It includes the requirement that groundwater is monitored for the life of a facility or 30 years after closure. As with all environmental regulations, there have been several amendments to the Act. One of the amendments that I'd like for you to know is referred to as the HSWA Act. And so HSWA is part of RCRA. It regulates generators of small quantities, so 100 kilograms per month is a cutoff for what is considered generators that must comply. These generators must certify that waste production has been minimized, and so that is part of this law. Not only do you have to track the production of hazardous waste, but you must certify that you are trying to minimize waste production. And then the other thing that was part of this, which is very critical, is that underground storage tanks had to provide corrosion protection and leak detection. This is a picture that you'll see again in the next lesson plan, and what I'm showing you here is an underground storage tank that at some point corroded and leaked into the environment. Also, with the Hazardous and Solid Waste Act, you have a land ban for any liquid hazardous waste. What this does is it prevents any land disposal of liquid hazardous waste. So as we talk in class of what the management options are, disposal in a landfill for liquid hazardous waste is not allowed under this amendment. It also requires that surface impoundments, which is one of the management options, these have to be retrofitted with the double liner system, monitoring wells, and leachate collection. And I want you to understand that with this amendment, the hazardous waste regulation cost increased from $1 to $3 billion per year to around $20 billion per year. So the cost to industry was exponential. And you can imagine that they weren't happy about this at the time. And although the 1984 amendment had a tremendous cost increase for industry, they were willing to accept it because in 1980, the CERCLA legislation was passed. So CERCLA stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, and it is meant to address abandoned hazardous waste sites that pose a public health risk. So this is sometimes called Superfund. One of the key aspects to CERCLA is it authorized the EPA to respond to actual and threatened releases for abandoned sites. The EPA was now authorized to go into private land holdings and respond to abandoned waste. It allowed the responsible parties to be held liable to damages and cleanup of that waste. And so liable means the generators of the pollution have to pay. This was really controversial because it was strict joint and several liability. Understand that in 1980, this was only 4 years after the 1976 legislation that first authorized or first prevented the release of hazardous waste. So many companies that had previously abandoned sites, they had generated that waste in a time that they were following the law. So they were not breaking any laws when they abandoned unlabeled drums or when they dumped perchloroethylene down the drain. At the time, they were not breaking any laws. And yet, in 1980, this legislation was passed and said, even though at the time you weren't breaking any laws, you were responsible to clean up the damage. And so it established liability without fault. And the joint liability comes in because if you think about a landfill that maybe had 20 different companies put waste in there, all 20 companies have to pay for the cleanup of that landfill site. And so this established a money source for cleanup. Now the problem for this, of course, is that many of the abandoned sites were abandoned because companies had previously filed bankruptcy or closed their doors. And so with this was the creation of what's called the Superfund. At the time, $1.6 billion was established to help pay for sites where the responsible parties could not pay. And the EPA established a national priority list to sort of rank the priority of which sites would be able to tap into that money. As of 2005, there were 1,239 sites on the list. In 1986, this was reauthorized, and they increased it to $8.6 billion at the time, and yet this still doesn't go very far. With the 1986 amendment, it required cost-effective remedial action. It dedicated $20 million a year to develop new technology. Because the money is not going very far, the EPA has acknowledged a need to develop new technology. Now, this 1986 amendment is called SARA, the Superfund Amendment and Reauthorization Act, and it is part of CERCLA. It also establishes an emergency planning and community right to know, and this is the web page that we'll be looking at. A web page to allow any citizen to know where these sites are. So before we go to the web page, I'm going to leave you with this quote from William Riley, a former EPA administrator. And this goes to the need for new innovation. We are cleaning up Superfund sites very slowly and at a very high cost. And the EPA administrator said, we desperately need technology breakthroughs. Engineers want to stay with the tried and true. Well, the tried and true is costing too much, and I've omitted a word there. But let's go to this webpage, and I need for you to print out a Superfund site for the class exercise. So let's go there. So go to this site and click on National Priorities List here, and then click on where you live. Go ahead and choose any region from where you're from, or region 7 where we currently are, and you'll see a list of all of the sites that are present. If you go back before you clicked on where you live, you'll see here the list of the current number of Superfund sites on the list. You'll see that there are 1,162 non-federal and 157 federal sites, so those would be largely military facilities. And then you'll see the number of sites that have completed construction and that have been deleted from the list. And so this gives you an idea of the magnitude of the problem and how quickly we are fixing sites as they come onto the Superfund National Priority List. See you in class.